Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest in the ValuesJam guest session series. And Francois, brilliant to have you here. To start with, please introduce yourself and tell everybody about the great work that you do.
Thanks so much, Alan. So just for context, I met Alan through Teach the Future because we are both part of that in terms of democratizing futures and sort of the whole futures space by teaching young people to think about multiple futures and to really, for me, bring back the idea of agency in terms of shaping your path forward, which is quite important in the South African context, which is where I'm from. Um, Long story short, I was an interior designer for 12 years. I did an undergrad in value and policy studies, and that's also where Alan piqued my interest, obviously, because he's very interested in this field. And then from there, after 12 years in interior design, I found out about futures. I did a postgrad in it, did better than expected, did a master's in it, did quite well in that. And then from there, I did a 1 year fellowship with the UNDP in terms of their new strategy and foresight division that they started in New York. And currently, I've been a researcher with SIA, which is the South African Institute of International Affairs, as part of their futures program for about a year now. And I do part-time work for the Institute of Futures Research in South Africa as well. So that, in a nutshell, gives you an idea. Basically, values, design, and futures thinking is where my interests align.
Yeah, and it sounds from what you've just described that you've certainly caught the futures bug. So,
I,
what was it that grabbed you?
I think for me, look, it's an interesting one in terms of I always say I felt very lost around about 2018, where I had spent a decade almost in interior design, and while I enjoyed it, it just didn't didn't feel as if I was doing the right thing with my life, essentially. And I went to a dinner party and somebody said to me, "Listen, have you thought about futures thinking?" And I said, "That sounds made up. I've never heard of it." And I Googled it and I found out about the idea. It's one of those things where you carry the intrinsic knowledge for a long while in terms of the idea of multiple futures, etc. And then suddenly you come across a grouping of people who think in the same way, and there's actually a field for this, and there's actually people talking about it and studying it, and there's a whole academic rigor with regards to it. And then, yeah, it just opened up many doorways for me. It's interesting. I'm also interested in conflict resolution, conflict management, and using futures for that. And with regards to that, again, it's something that I sat and thought I am the only one thinking about this. Reached out to somebody who then put me onto a course with Ivana at Meta Futures, which I'm doing now as well, which is all about that essentially in terms of conflict resolution and futures thinking. So there's always definitely people out there thinking the same way as you. You just need to find them.
Yeah, you reminded me of Values Jam this week, actually. It was about the value of learning. And we found ourselves exploring a metaphor of imagine that you're staying in a small town and you know that you're on the coast, but you're standing on a road and there's some residential buildings, and you see a pathway on the other side of the road. And it kind of goes into the distance, and you're curious and you wander down the pathway, and then it takes a right turn and you take the right turn, and then after another 100 yards, it opens up to the beach and the ocean in front of you. And that's kind of describing what you were saying about your journey.
Completely, completely. And I think also we've spoken a little bit before, just in terms of I don't think the journey ever ends. I think
Yeah.
at this stage, I'm really enjoying the futures field. I am enjoying what I'm learning about conflict resolution, but I think this idea of lifelong learning definitely appeals to me more than to others to a certain extent, because it just life excites me to a certain extent.
Yeah. And I guess the other great thing about futures thinking is that the future never arrives, right?
Well, exactly, exactly. I think that is also the main like just the wonder of it for me in terms of I was journaling this morning and it came up for me that it's this idea of being ever present and ever in the now, but also being able to dream about the different futures that are there. And it's sometimes enough to just dream. It's sometimes enough to just actually go, listen, I'm never going to be able to do all of the 300 million things that my mind can fathom. But there's also some beauty in that in terms of discerning what can I change, what can't I change, and reminding myself of my agency in that.
Yeah. And actually, that point about the future never arriving, ValuesJam does this, we've found, and it brings to the surface memories that might have been kind of hidden or lost for quite some time. And I haven't thought of this for some time, but you've reminded me of my granddad. And when I was very young, so probably about 7, he said to me, Alan, would you like me to give you a sixpence? So I was like, well, yeah. And he said, okay, I'll give it to you tomorrow. Can you remind me? So I said, okay, thank you very much. Next day arrived. I said, Grandad, do you remember our conversation? You said you were going to give me a sixpence. And he said, yeah, I do. And when did I say that I was going to give it to you? And I said, tomorrow. And he said, okay, remind me.
That's so sweet. And what a wonderful way to teach the lesson as well.
Well, you say it's sweet. It felt really, it feels a bit cruel to me now. So listen, I'm gonna tip out the cards from the Values Jam deck.
Perfect.
So how many piles would you like me to make in front of me?
Let's do 3.
3. Okay, they're different sizes, and pile 1 is on my left, pile 3 is on my right. So which pile would you like?
Let's go actually for the middle.
Okay, and now we have 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 19 cards. So a number between 1 and 19.
Dear Lord. Number 17. Don't know
17.
why, but yes, let's see what comes up.
Okay. All right. Well, so the card that you've chosen is health. And the first
Interesting.
question is, what does health mean? And what does it look, feel, and sound like?
Ooh. Um, so look, in the spirit of honesty, it's always been health has been one of those constant issues in my life in terms of I have quite an ill mother who was in a car accident. She had 8 back operations, etc., etc. It's just essentially like ill health has been part of the journey for her since about the age of 30. So it's always been a part of my life as well. And an interesting one for me was always this idea of health is being pain-free. But in the last while, I've realized this applies to mental health, physical health, everything for me is just in terms of it's not about avoiding the pain necessarily. It's about finding ways of transforming the pain because pain is a part of life and you can't avoid it. And it's about that resilience and just finding ways of transforming it, whatever it may be. So that for me is definitely where I'm sitting at the moment when it comes to health. Um, and sort of the duality that we experience with regards to the idea of also pain and avoidance. And I don't want to be unhealthy and I don't want to go there. Um, and then just in terms of what does it feel like and look like, it for me personally, the more I sort of really like submerge myself in all of these different fields that I spoke about. It's about balance. It's really about this idea of cultivating the both and rather than the either or. In terms of I have a colleague who is suffering from cancer, and I sent her the message this morning and said to her, listen, I know you've received 300 million messages in terms of get better, we're thinking of you, etc. But you also need to remind yourself it's okay to shout expletives at the sky sometimes. You need to also have the balance of dealing with the sorrow and the heartache of the fallibility of your body, essentially. And if we forget that, we really are imbalanced. And that to me is more unhealthy than the sort of Western picture that we have of what unhealthy is.
What a great start. So when we drew the card, I found myself thinking, like you started to do, I was thinking about all of the different aspects of health. So whether it be physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, relationship based, or whatever it is, financial. So all of that, the spectrum of health. And when you were talking about the guy with cancer, I find myself thinking about when somebody is not well, or even if they kind of have an accident or something like that, it almost seems to be a default for people to say, get well soon, you'll be back on track in no time, you'll be back to 100% and stronger, without knowing that that's going to be the case. So it sounds really kind of, and I don't mean to be offensive to people that do that, because the intention is good, but actually it's not very deeply thought through. And the way that I deal with that is that I tend to say to people, I hope it can go as well as it can. So,
Yes.
sort of allowing for things to go wrong if that's the way that it's going to go. And maybe I'm overthinking it. I don't know. What do you think?
No, completely. I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment, just in terms of what, as you were speaking, it came to mind that I listened to a podcast the other day where somebody said, from the perspective of death, all of life is stand-up comedy. And we tend to forget that constantly in terms of the pain and the suffering in terms of your body, your mind, everything is part of this existence. It can't be taken away. As we were speaking, it reminded me of my dad, who is 73, and my dad is carrying a lot of emotional baggage, and it's really affecting his life. And I had a conversation with him a while ago where I said to him, listen, you're retired now, you can afford it. Why don't you go to therapy? And he immediately said, but I see a psychiatrist and I take my medicine. And it's that sort of line of thinking that to me is just problematic at this stage in terms of we medicate away the suffering of life that actually, if you want to bring it back to values, drives our core values in terms of how we perceive who we are and what's happening.
Yeah. And then the other thing about health, and I appreciate how personal you're making this conversation, so I'm gonna mirror that for you. So during COVID, I it was only then that I realized how precious health really is. Because up until that point, I've been fortunate enough to be reasonably healthy. I'm not very fit, but I'm not, ill very often. Um, but then when it kind of slams you in the face and you realize how fragile life is, then it makes you think, whoa, I probably need to invest a bit more effort in this. And yet, why is it that we take our car for an annual service, but we don't do the same for ourselves?
Completely, completely. And I think also this notion of self-care being all about bubble baths and essentially indulging the glass of red wine every now and then, to me is really like that's a faulty way of looking at it because I think true self-care and true like looking after yourself is sitting with the uncomfortability of your like impermanence to a certain extent. And with regards to that, in terms of going to see the right people who can help you. It doesn't always have to be a medical professional. Sometimes all you need in order for your check-in is to see a friend that you haven't seen in ages and to have a conversation like this about what's actually going on in your life. What's actually happening? Like, what are the things that are uncomfortable? What is the real dis-ease that you're dealing with? And just having that.
Yeah. And you mentioned medication just now, and I can't remember where I heard this from, but it must be outside of the UK. But I was listening to somebody talking about how when you go to see a doctor, wherever they are, um, you might be told that you need to take up gardening. You might be told that you should read more. and this sort of stuff, rather than here's some more pills. And that struck me. I don't know why I don't remember where it was, if it struck me as being such a good idea. But and I think that, you mentioned values as well. I've got this kind of curiosity and also irritation about why is it that in the well-being agenda, values doesn't get more of a shout out? Because if we were to focus on our values more proactively, I believe, no evidence of this, but I believe intuitively that we would reduce the amount of time that's needed for interventions and correction and all of that stuff. And there's a cynical voice in my head that's saying, well, the thing is, the well-being industry wouldn't want that, would they? Because it would reduce the size of the industry. Um, what's it like in that space in South Africa?
Look, we come from an interesting background, as the rest of the world knows, just in terms of as a white South African as well. And I was thinking about it before I went into this talk, just in terms of how values were shaped during apartheid and how they were shaped afterwards. And many interesting conversations that I had with my parents in terms of why did they stay? Why did they not do more, etc., etc. And it's such an interesting one in terms of, you touched upon it now, but the interaction between values and health. Because if I look at my mom, for instance, she stayed quiet about so many things, and it's a personal belief that I do think that had a resonance in her own body in terms of the trauma of seeing everything happening around her and not necessarily, or speaking up, and speaking up in a very limited way. It definitely affected her. And I think certain people are more sensitive to it than others. I mean, for myself as well, if you look at anything happening on Instagram and social media nowadays, it's all about trauma informed, etc. And I'm all for it. Yay, we're having mental health conversations here. But I think a key component of it that's missing is, for personally, it's, if I transgress my own values, it resonates in my body as disease. And if I keep doing that, it turns into feeling unwell, as simple as that. And I do think in the South African context, there's a lot of the older generation in terms of the baby boomers who are really at the heart of apartheid in terms of, I'm speaking from the white experience here in South Africa, but that are dealing with a lot of issues with regards to what happened in terms of they were sold a vision of what was going on in the country and what was going on in the world in terms of, I mean, it's a ridiculous system, apartheid, in terms of how indoctrinated everybody was. And to suddenly realize in the 80s, listen, firstly, we are the culprits here. We are the ones in the wrong. And secondly, a lot of what we believed in terms of the basic tenets of life, they were lied to us. And a lot of those people are sitting with the severe, for lack of a better word, issues, both physically and mentally, that they can't necessarily pinpoint to. But if you look at it from the outside, you can definitely see there's a correlation there.
Mm. And you're touching here on, I don't even know if this is a phrase, maybe you know whether it is or not, but kind of social health or
Yes.
community health
Yes.
is what we're talking about here. And if you think about everything that's going on in the world and the wars that are happening at the moment, I hadn't really thought about this before, but there's something sick about some societies, some communities that in a way is very similar to what you were describing about in an individual. This thing about if you experience all of that stuff, it manifests itself in ill health in some way or another. And hmm. So
Yeah.
so on that point, have you thought about this concept of social health or community health? I'm just curious about what do you think needs to be in place to provide a foundation for a thriving, prospering social situation or community situation to avoid, the illness.
Look, I did my master's thesis on mental health in South Africa, mental health provision, and how that actually affects economic growth as well, because there's a clear correlation between countries that do take to tend more care from a governmental perspective in terms of mental health care provision and how they perform economically. And through that, I came across this really interesting initiative, which is called the Friendship Benches, and it started in Zimbabwe. And essentially, in Zimbabwe, you're sitting with two psychiatrists in the entire country because the economy collapsed. There's nobody there. And one of the psychiatrists just said, listen, there's no way I can see everyone. They've also got like real shortage of trained professionals just in terms of any sphere, but specifically with regards to mental health. He then saw all of these grannies, or as we refer to them down south, gogos, who are unemployed, sitting and doing nothing. And he started training en masse, basically thousands, started with hundreds, but now it's thousands of these grannies to do talk therapy and to be available on these benches. And people can set up an appointment with them. And then you sit and talk like we are now for an hour. And through that, if you look it up, it's been remarkable. It's now been rolled out basically throughout the whole of Southern Africa. It's actually been transferred to America at this stage as well. And it's a bottom-up sort of way of really taking care of communities and bringing that communal spirit back into it and learning from elders. And it taps into so many different things. So that immediately comes to mind for me. But also in a broader sense, I do think, and that's what the important work or the importance of your work is specifically with regards to bringing attention back to values, how they are shaped and how they inform how we look at the future or futures. Because I do think in order to have a real values conversation, we need to sort of shake off the veneer of protection that the ego holds. And we need to build spaces where we can really communicate in terms of not just the injustice of what people are experiencing, but the actual pain that it is causing. So let's move away or move. It's definitely there is a space for social justice, but we need to really inhabit it with the humanity underneath, the shared strife of this existence. In that way, we can recalibrate, relook at our values, and then say, listen, many of these things that we believe are illnesses can actually just be treated by reading a book, being in community, slowing down essentially, and having that. So I'm a big advocate for the idea of getting as many people in the room as possible and building it from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
Yeah, what a thought. So let's we've gone big to start with. So let's go really small now, and let me ask you, when have you experienced health?
I I lived in London in 2008, sorry. And look, as much as I love the Brits and as much as I love the UK, London was not good for me. And I was really, really ill there in terms of every sphere was just falling apart. It was my body, I was constantly achy, I was getting weird rashes, mentally I was spiraling, etc. And then from there, I completely went to the other side of the world and went to Israel, of all things. It was, as a South African, it was one of the few places I could get to without a visa. And I went there, lay in the sunshine for about a week, and then got a job picking bananas. And that always, for me, stands out as the healthiest period in my life because I essentially woke up in the morning early, had my morning coffee, really worked hard, got at least 10 to 12 kilometers in of walking and picking bananas, went for a swim, had lunch, had a nap, basically had dinner and started the next day. And I was feeling like it literally felt as if my body was just glowing with health. And I've thought about that so many times in terms of what was it for me that felt made me feel so anchored and safe within my own being at that stage. And in all honesty, it's routine. It's the routine of it that made it easier for me to deal with life essentially on life's terms, if you want to call it that way. So I do think we also need to realize we are very complex. but we've got certain basic checklists that we need to adhere to in terms of if I don't get sunshine during the day, I'm not going to feel good. If I don't drink enough water, if I don't get enough sleep, if I don't at least walk for 20 minutes, etc. There's basic things that I need to do in order to feel healthy. I don't always do them. Definitely not. I am not a model in any way in terms of like the routine lifestyle, but I do think there is something with regards to that in terms of inhabiting real health and sort of cross-pollinating with that is also I'm really interested in the idea of monasticism, this idea of sort of following more of a monastic lifestyle in terms of building the time in for yourself to do the basics and get that right. And then from there, I think health is a side effect. I don't think it's necessarily something you need to strive for.
What a great thought. I've got a picture of you picking bananas now. I'm not going to be able to get that out of my head. And I think there is absolutely something in what you're saying about routine and simplicity, because when you describe it like you just did, and I suppose it doesn't apply just to physical health, it applies to um, emotional, psychological as well, because for instance, I know people that will get really stressed out about what they're going to wear today.
Hmm.
And I just wear a black t-shirt. And I've got a number of black t-shirts. And so, that's kind of, I don't have any hassle as far as that is concerned. It just takes it completely away. And I don't understand why you would expose yourself to that level of stress when you've got loads of other things to be stressed about.
No, exactly.
But everybody's different, right? Um, And then the other thing, well, two things you made me think of. One, my healthiest time I remember was a summer when I had a summer job as a barman in a hotel, and it was in a place called Eastbourne on the south coast in the UK. And so my shift was like 10 in the morning until around about 3, and then 6 until close. So that 3 hours in the afternoon, I used to go running up onto Beachy Head or playing football. And you making me think about that now. I remember the first day we played football and being out of breath after like 5 minutes. But then within a matter of probably 4 or 5 days, we could play football for 2 hours.
Yes.
And like I think you use the adjective glowing, your body felt glowing, and I relate to that completely, because you just felt like you could go on forever. Um, so that really was a good feeling. And then I've kind of brought it up to date, and I'm wondering why I choose not to invest more in my health. And specifically, I was thinking, if I had a piece of work that I needed to finish by a deadline or before a call or whatever it is, I would find a way to get it done, jam it in, do it.
Yes.
Whereas I don't do that with a run, for instance. If I'm going to
Yes.
go for a run and something gets in the way, I don't kind of always make the choice to protect the run time. Um, so that's a bit stupid, right?
No, exactly, exactly. And I mean, I think you're preaching to the converted here in terms of that. It is definitely a ring so true. And I mean, I don't know for you in that period when you felt as healthy. I think for me also, like one thing that underscored all of it was also there was a level of authenticity because I had been pushed so far out of my comfort zone in London that I really was running on basically zero. That it also gave me the freedom to, for the first time, sort of leave the social airs and graces, etc., behind. I honestly did not care about competing with anyone and being on the career treadmill, etc. I wanted to pick bananas because it made me feel good. Did it for a couple of months and I felt reset enough to actually take it from there. And even in my own life now, when I have moments where I feel healthy, it's because I feel synchronized with actually my inner being in terms of being able to draw healthy boundaries, to speak from the heart, if you want to call it that, in terms of really bringing my honest self to fruition. That for me is, I still get those sparks of 2008 in the current realm. So I don't know if that resonates with you at all.
Yeah, it does. And you're making me wonder if, your story about London and then the bananas, and I'm thinking also of what I was saying about COVID. Do you think that it helps people to appreciate their health more if they've experienced illness?
Hugely,
So,
hugely.
so is there a case for do we make a case for making sure that people understand what illness feels like? Because we don't do that.
Hmm. No, completely. Completely. I mean, it's as you touched upon earlier in terms of the health industry is definitely not going to lean into that side of things in terms of the benefits of actually just sitting with the discomfort of life. They are going to offer a solution in terms of like, how do we take this away as quickly as possible?
Mm.
And please don't get me wrong, I am all for the medical fraternity. I am for the health industry, etc. Do whatever you must to get you through this. It's just in my own experience when I've actually allowed myself to actually sit really in the discomfort for a while, and I then come through it, I have a much bigger appreciation for what health actually means to me, both physically and mentally. And with that, it underscores it with a sense of gratitude, which then sort of creates a positive feedback loop in terms of the more grateful you are, the better you feel. And it just goes from there.
Yeah. And I'm wondering about the education system here because, at school, I'm not really that close to it, but my understanding is that there is some sort of education around, sugar's not so good for you, and it'd be better if you ate more fruit and vegetables and, that kind of thing. But I wonder if anybody's experimented with showing children what ill looks like
Yes.
as a result of not leading a very good life,
Yes.
as part of that better understanding of the bad side, the dark side, so that you're more encouraged to do the stuff that you should do rather than just talking about the good stuff, which seems a bit like, well, I'm healthy enough anyway, so why should I bother?
Exactly. Exactly. And I think you're touching on quite a core component of it for me is just this idea of the difference between sympathy and empathy when it comes to other people's ill health. I think we've been trained as sort of a westernized society. It's very acceptable to have sympathy and go, listen, I feel for you, you're going to get better, etc. But to actually sit with somebody in that pain and in that muck and to say, listen, I'm holding space for you. And you don't have to put on a brave face. You can actually just be who you are. You can share the pain, you can cry if you want to, etc. Like that, I think, is what is needed. I think we really need to re-emphasize the idea of how important it is to just be empathetic to everyone's suffering in whichever way it comes. I mean, if you look at it in terms of from a systems thinking perspective, etc., we are all interconnected. We are all part of the one. We are it's one human body, if you want to call it that. And if we can't show empathy towards each other and be rather flippant about the idea of, ugh, it will get better and it's not really my problem, then we miss an opportunity for ourselves to actually expose ourselves to the pain of this life in order to then, as I said, build the gratitude feedback loop and take it from there.
Mm. So if the two of us who are not in the health industry can see the benefit of, for instance, a not very well person visiting a school to talk about how they got to where they are, and that doesn't happen, why not? Why is it that that's not a strategy that has been, maybe it has, maybe I'm just unaware, but and I think what you were saying about sympathy has got something to do with that. Maybe there's a reluctance to um, expose young children to sickness or people that are not very well, um, because you don't want to upset them. But actually, it's
Mm.
a reality. It's just part of what is. So
Completely.
why not?
Completely. And I mean, it's interesting how the mind works. As you were speaking, I was thinking, as kids, we used to go visit old age homes in terms of visiting with the elderly, etc., which is a lovely, lovely thing. And I definitely think it's amazing. What is interesting about it is we visit the elderly, but we would never go to a hospice. And at the end of the day, we're still dealing with people at the end of life. And I think if we can just normalize the fact that, and I mean, there's good work being done that I even know about in terms of just dealing with the end of life cycle and this idea of sort of being a Sherpa for the people crossing over. None of us have an idea what's on the other side, but all of us have an idea of what disease feels like, what uncomfortability, what sadness, what loneliness, etc. feels like. And as long as we can do everything in our power to bridge that human gap, we don't need to know what's going on the other side. We
Yeah.
don't need to know if there is another side. That's completely out of the realm of our control. What is within our control is essentially to help with this burden of disease in other people.
It's a bit of a tangent, but I saw a video recently with the Dalai Lama, who apparently, according to the video, he practices dying 5 times a day. So, he practices that last breath,
Yes.
which is, I can't get my head around it. I remember when I heard it, I thought, oh, I wonder what that would be like to do, and I haven't actually done it. But 5 times a day. So when it happens for him, he will be ready for sure.
Yes. No, exactly. Exactly. And I mean, it's always, I think about it, I was in quite a bad car accident when I was about 21, where my brother and I were driving. It was a wet road and the car skidded and we essentially rolled 3 times and came to we ended up on the wheels of the car again, but the whole roof was missing, etc. And both of us miraculously walked away without
Wow.
a scratch. Interesting about it is we had a conversation about it afterwards, and for all intents and purposes, this is the closest we ever came to death, or actually the fear of real disability.
Yeah.
And people speak about their lives flashing in front of their eyes, etc. And both of us, that did not ring true for. For us, it was just a calm. There was nothing else. It was obviously the feeling of, here we go, and something is wrong. But in those, like, let's say 2 or 3 seconds, it wasn't this, ooh, like I
Yeah.
need to, yeah, it's my life flashed before my eyes, or there was big sadness or anything about it. It was just calm.
Mm. And you reminded me of two stories. One is about a guy who he used to read to his kids when they were going to sleep each night. Not read, he used to make up a story. Um, and they went to sleep. And so often the next day they'd be saying, Daddy, what happened in the story, right? Because they'd fallen asleep. So he decided that he was going to write these stories up, and he had 200 of them.
Cool.
So they were just written up and existed. He got cancer, and he was in hospital, and his wife and kids thought it would be a good idea to take his stories into him to read with him because they didn't know what was going to happen, how much time was left. Anyway, he recovered, and those stories have now been serialized for a TV series, and
Amazing.
they're in like 40 countries around the world or something. And
Amazing.
it is amazing. And what's kind of really weird is that that wouldn't be if he hadn't got cancer. It's
Yes.
like, and then the other one, I saw a documentary the other night about a young man who sounds very similar to what you described with, and that's what reminded me, flipping the car. And he was paralyzed from the chest down. Um, he was a promising footballer and had been on the bench, I think, for his local football team. And again, funnily enough, south coast of England, again, a place called Worthing. And so he decided to use his insurance money that he got to buy the football club. And then they've been on this upward trajectory ever since. And they're now just below the official football leagues. So, he has found his life because of
Yes,
a severe disability, which again sounds like a contradiction, but it's true. So maybe where this is taking me is to, although health is so important, it's actually just a little component of the whole.
exactly, exactly. And unfortunately, I think we put such a big impetus on this idea of health, wealth, like everything needs to go well. It can't just be okay. It can't just be a facet of life. It has to be 100% perfect all around and needs to be better and better and better. And we need to take every single supplement that we possibly can, etc. But at the end of the day, life is still gonna life. It is just what it is. It's you're not gonna cheat death. You are not gonna get away from the pain of this existence and the beauty of this pain of this existence.
Mm.
Um, I stopped drinking alcohol about 6 years ago, and it's always interesting for me in terms of I come across friends and acquaintances who really imbibe still a lot, really, really do. But then on the other hand, it is every yoga session and everything you can think of possibly in terms of mushrooms and ashwagandha and to feel better. And I'm a little bit like, okay, fine, I'm completely for it, but shouldn't we take care of the big problem first? And the problem is not the alcohol. The problem is that you're using alcohol because you're not necessarily looking at the details of your life that you're uncomfortable with. You are not staring into the abyss and going, listen, at the end of the day, I'm a flesh encased being on a planet that is circling a sun, that we actually don't understand any of this. And instead of screaming into the void, just actually being okay with it and not drinking it away. And then from there, let's look at health.
That's a great thought. On Values Jam, there's an opportunity for you to create your own question as well. So I'd like you to consider this now. So ask your own question about health, beginning with who, what, where, when, why, or how. And if you've got the answer immediately, please feel free to share. Or if you'd prefer, I can go first.
I think you can go first. Let's
So,
start it off.
so you,
You're better versed at this than I am. So,
well, I can answer first, but you need to create the question.
okay. Okay. With regards to health, let me just think. Um, what does health for you mean? What is it the absence of, essentially?
Go on, say that again.
What is absent in order for you to be healthy? Let's put it that way.
Or
In
what is
terms,
absent?
yes.
Excess.
Hmm,
So you used the word balance earlier.
hmm.
Um, and actually, when you were talking about alcohol, I think I heard it was a radio program the other day, and the guy was saying it's not so much the alcohol that you consume, it's the bad habits that you fall into when you've been drinking alcohol, because that's
Exactly.
when you have that extra kebab on the way home or whatever.
Exactly.
So, so health is I think, the absence of excess, and also there's something about gratitude and the appreciation of what is, and being able to respond to that in a kind of um, not a reactionary way, although that's a contradiction as well, because you are reacting, but it's not it's like, okay, that's happened, so this is what I'm going to do, rather than be all excited or stressed or
Yes.
whatever about it. So, absence of excess, gratitude, and ability to respond in a controlled manner, I would say, come to mind. What about you?
just on that, it's interesting in terms of while you were speaking, all of that to me applies to the idea of planetary boundaries as well. If you really want to take it to that extent, in terms of it's excess is killing us. It's as simple as that. It's just essentially finding that balance is key. So yeah, thank you for that. I think for me, it is definitely again, and it ties into your last point. That's why I like the idea of futures thinking, is the idea to not just be knee-jerk reactionary. I feel as if with modern life, in terms of if you look at it from the governmental structures to the personal structures, we have so much coming at us, and it's the way of life is to react immediately and react and say sorry and then say sorry. Just it's this like constant spiel of wronging and apologizing because you're just acting from a very unregulated nervous system to a certain extent. And that to me rings true 100%. My partner and I always joke about it. We've been together for a couple of years, and our fights don't look like screaming matches or anything like that, because we've learned the value of going, listen, I need 10 minutes here. And let's just sit for 10 minutes. We don't leave the room. You sit for 10 minutes and then actually saying, listen, I've had time to think about it now. This is why I'm reacting this way. And if we can't figure it out in that 10 minutes, we can pause it as well. But it's just to go, listen, he refers to it as the inner child. I refer to it as my inner saboteur, whatever. But that is what's speaking at that moment, because it comes from a place of pain. It doesn't necessarily come from a place where I feel completely integrated. And I can just, I think that's the biggest gift that I wish for this world, is just enough time to actually think about what you're doing, think about the broader impacts of what you're doing, and then respond. You're never going to get it 100% right,
Yeah.
but I do think 90% of the problems will be cancelled out if we can do that.
And I'm curious, how long did it take you to kind of get into the swing of that? Because it strikes me that right at the beginning of that journey, it must have been quite tough, because when you're in conflict with somebody, emotions are running high. And so for one person to say, could we take a 10-minute break? Probably
It
wouldn't
did
sit
not go
well.
down well initially, let's be honest. Like, it was the first time I tried it. I also did it without warning, where I just said, listen, I'm going to take 10 minutes. And I could see he was stewing to the point of no return. But when we actually resolved everything, the next day he came to me and he was like, that was the best thing you could have possibly done, because I felt held and seen by you not walking away and saying, listen, I'm committing to sorting out this conflict, but I need to do it from a healthy place. And now it's grown to the point where initially our rule was you don't go to bed angry. Now we go to bed saying, listen, let's put a pin in this and actually just revisit it tomorrow. We don't have to sort it out tonight. Whatever we come up with now, if we really are speaking from a place of hurt or confusion or whatever it may be, I mean, there's also so many different factors weighing in on it, in terms of you might not have eaten, it's hormonal, there's so many things. So to just actually go, listen, we'll sleep on it tonight, we'll revisit it when we both feel ready for it, and then we'll actually chart a way forward. That to me has been one of the most earth-shattering, amazing changes ever. I'm doing it in my personal life at this stage. I ideally want to take that out into professional life, etc. as well. But I do think there is just something to go, listen, I need 5 minutes, and then we can re-engage.
What I love about what you're talking about here is that, and control might not be the right word exactly, but it's kind of in that direction, rather than being a slave to time, for instance.
Exactly.
And I was talking to somebody about this as well this week, that I used to be a slave to deadlines.
Yes.
So, if something had a deadline, then I would make sure, move hell and high water to get something done. Whereas now, I just think about all of the things that are there to do. Is that deadline still relevant? What will happen if we move the deadline, and will people be okay with that? And so I'm kind of less beholden to time now than I used to be. And that's what you're describing about saying,
Completely.
either the 10 minutes or whether it's, look, let's talk about this tomorrow when we're both fresh. Um, yeah. So taking control of time. So I'm conscious of time, and it's talking about time, didn't mean to do that. And it has flown by. It's been a great conversation, and we always close a values jam with the same question, which is this: what are you encouraged to do differently about health as a result of this conversation?
Ooh, look, again, I need time and I am going to get back to you, but because it's going to percolate. I know there's going to be a lot from this conversation. In this moment, the one thing that really stood out for me is just, and it actually came from your side, is just again this idea of removing excess in your life of anything. I think that's the main sort of the core of the conversation that we've been having, because we are so focused on feeling healthy and feeling good and avoiding the negative, perceived negative sides of life, that we do that in excess and we strive for that. And it's not about gaining that balance. So I think for me, that is the main takeaway of this conversation, is to really sit and figure out what are my values around living a balanced, zero excessive approach to just having 2 feet firmly planted on the ground.
Okay. And if I can ask you, when will be your first opportunity, first baby steps to move in that direction that you've just described?
I think it's going to be an ongoing thing in terms of this permeates every single facet of my life. In terms of baby steps for me is definitely I sort of I replaced my alcohol usage with sugar usage. I am the biggest sugar addict in the whole wide world. And also with that, it's one of those things where for a long while I've been speaking about it and I've been thinking about it in terms of I need to cut it down, etc. But I haven't really sat down and thought about my values surrounding it. And this conversation has definitely, as a baby step, just in terms of building a more regulated life and body and truly embodying balance, starts with that.
Mm. Thanks, Francois. Mine, I think, is about people that are not well.
Mm,
Because when I think about the circles that I operate in, I don't go anywhere near people that are not well.
mm.
And I'm curious to understand what sort of impact that might have, actually. So I'm going to find a way to do that. And I'm not sure, what sort of people they're going to be. You've talked about hospices. I know somebody who is an end of life doula. I might speak to him about this. Um, because, and I'm feeling, because of this conversation, that I'm hiding it away, actually. So I
We
want
all are. It's not just you. I think it's one of those things where we tend to avoid what is coming to a certain extent. We don't want to be faced with it. So I don't think you need to be hard on yourself about it. I just think what a wonderful realization. And I'm very excited to hear back from you, just in terms of if you dip your toe on that side in terms of what sprouts forth for you.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that conversation where you say, I only have 2 Mars bars a day now, and I say, yeah, and I visited somebody who died the week after I visited them. And it
Exactly.
would be interesting to see where that conversation goes. Right.
Exactly.
So, Francois, thank you so much for joining this Values Jam. It's been, um, I'm feeling moved actually. Yeah, physically, I feel different. And so thanks for that being enlightening for me.
Right back at you. This has been wonderful. And yeah, just continue the good work that you're doing. Thanks so much, Alan.
All right, cheers.
Thank you.